From No5 Chambers, I'm Richard Kimblin, and this is the Planning Podcast. In this edition, we turn to cities with Ben Rogers, Director of the Centre for London. We explore major issues arising from the pandemic. Is it the death of cities? Spoiler alert, no. We look at suppressed demand, the impacts of planning reform, zoning, design codes, and participation by communities. We look at planning levers beyond regulation and how tax, including local taxes, could be a tool to promote or disincentivise different uses and developments. There is a lot in it. So, here we go. Hi, Ben. Good morning. How are you?
I'm very well. Beautiful sunny day today.
Sunny, optimism. That sounds like a place that we need to be today. Thank you for being with us. Now, Ben, you are the director of
Centre for London. I set up Centre for London almost 10 years ago. We are London's dedicated think tank. We develop new solutions to London's big problems, and we do that through our research, events, sort of convening and influencing. We're a charity. I think what makes us special is we're not a membership organisation, so we are disinterested, and we're very good at bringing different bits of London and different London leaders from different sectors together around a table and using our research and I hope our policy nous and creativity to find solutions and develop new ways of tackling things.
Now, Ben, I'm familiar with many of your reports and the material which you have in the FT from time to time. I think it would help if we put on our website a link to your website so that listeners can follow that up if they want to and see the exciting material which you've produced over time.
That would be great.
So, Ben, you've also been doing op-eds from time to time in the FT, and your thinking in that regard is out there. And in particular, I noticed that you were writing a little earlier on in the pandemic during the course of May about the effect of the pandemic on global cities. Shall we start off there?
Yeah, let's. And I'm pessimistic in the short run and more optimistic in the long run. I mean, you can see how a lot of people are speculating, is this the end of the city? What with social distancing and the sort of collapse in public transport use. The fact people got used to working from home and working remotely. You can see why business owners and mayors are sort of worrying about the future of the city. And if I was owning property in central London, I would be a little concerned, at least in the short run. But I actually think lots of these things represent a big gain. Clearly, it suddenly seemed mad that we were all commuting into the city every day, leaving our homes empty for half a day and leaving office space empty for half the day. So I can see a sort of big gain in that regard. I also think there'll be a role for cities in the future. I think that you do need to meet face to face. I think that's particularly important for younger people. And I think it still remains the case that most innovation happens, or a lot of innovation happens face to face, and cities are the only place where you get that sort of really intense face to face contact. I think what we might see is a city which uses space more efficiently, where people go in once or twice a week, and that will free up room for greater number of users, or to convert properties currently used for business more for homes. And I think also cities will probably get younger. I'm not sure that's necessarily completely a good thing, but I suspect that particularly if this thing proves to be really endemic and we struggle to get rid of it, or it's followed up by something else, I can imagine a situation where it's already the case that cities attract younger people in particularly, and younger people, I'm afraid, are particularly good at innovation and productivity, but I can see that becoming sort of more pronounced. That in case will be a boost. I think the other thing to say is that clearly this is a big blow to some of the things that cities do very well, and some particularly sort of urban industries, entertainment, hospitality, performance, culture, all of that. But cities are also centres, and particularly London is a centre of digital industries and digital innovation, and this will be a huge boost to that sector. In a way which means that actually it might advantage cities which have got strong digital bases. And again, I think because London is already a sort of leading brand around the world, with leading institutions, leading cultural institutions, leading educational institutions. If the whole world is going to start going online to see performances or study at universities, they're going to go to LSE, UCL, the Royal Opera House. So paradoxically, you can imagine how the further digitalization of work and leisure could actually end up giving some leading digital cities a bit of a boost.
Wow, there's a lot there, isn't there? Let's have a think about some of those points, which are just fantastic. I mean, the starting point, of course, is that we have cities with these wonderful arteries in the nature of tube lines, mass transport, and they're relatively empty, and we have these immense spaces for people to gather together and work in its offices, and they're relatively empty. And that's your short-term hit, alongside wonderful organisations such as everything from Sadler's Wells to the Royal Opera House, empty.
Yeah.
So short-term pessimism, but you're looking ahead, and your view is that there is change, and that the younger part of the population will be keen to get back, keen face to face, and that there will be an evolution.
That's right. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, there's so much demand on central London that it's really hard to imagine it becoming a sort of tumbleweed city, really, because even if some people choose to leave, there's so much sort of suppressed demand for these spaces that others will sort of move in, and you just got to sort of share an amount of sort of infrastructure and investment that's got into that, which I think will for a long time always be valued and needed. So, and cities do, don't they, go through sort of cycles where they become very expensive, almost too successful, then there's a bit of a collapse, and sort of perhaps younger and innovators sort of move in, and then they boom again, and that there seems to be we went through that in the sort of collapse of cities in the sort of 70s and early 80s, and then they resuscitated themselves, and maybe we'll see some of that dynamic. But I don't want to underplay how dire it seems, and I mean particularly for London in one regard in particular, which is that it has a very sort of unresilient funding model. I mean, if you take New York or Paris, the mayor and the city governments raise a lot of money locally, and they've got a sort of large number of different sources of income. Well, London only really has two sources of income, or the mayor only has two sources of income, money that he gets from government and money from the fare box, TfL, and the fare box has absolutely collapsed. The government's had to come in and quite rightly bail TfL out, but we're sort of slightly at the mercy of government, and that's probably not great given the sort of political complexion of the government and the mayoralty. And yeah, so I think the sort of just the sheer sort of lack of resilience of the sort of government business model in London has been sort of sorely exposed by this crisis, and when we do need to move to a sort of, I think the mayor and London government just need a bit more control over taxes raised in the capital. They shouldn't all be going to central government.
Right. So the public sector support is not as strong and resilient in London as one sees in some other global cities, which I suppose that's not going to change instantly. So one perhaps has to think about the effectiveness of innovators. And I do wonder whether there is a really positive story that might unfold if one thinks about areas such as Clerkenwell through to Shoreditch, next door to each other. That's a story of previous industrial uses and turning into really innovative mixes of uses and activities, everything creative that you can think of, alongside the digital. And aren't those relatively young industries populated by relatively young people just going to carry on?
I think so. And what will be interesting to see is whether that spreads to the older districts, and Oxford Street, will be a sort of case in point where it just feels right now often a slightly sort of sad and I think not very well used space. And will the Oxford Street of the future, include some retail, some housing, and a lot of sort of digital start spaces for sort of startups, question mark.
The government certainly seems to have laid out a route to that sort of outcome by introducing a new Class E to permit flexible switching between a whole range of uses, which certainly one would not have imagined to be so flexibly interchangeable. Shops, financial, professional, restaurants, cafes, offices, light industry, health, all of those things can now interchange. And with your Oxford Street example, one can imagine a great variety and vitality of uses springing up without much planning intervention.
Well, I think be wary of unintended consequences, and I'm not a huge fan of permitted development when it comes to housing, but I think that vision is a sort of a attractive one, and it's what often puzzled me. Why if you sort of walk down Oxford Street at 9 o'clock at night, it's completely dead, and why couldn't it's not beyond the sort of ken of man to imagine how you might take sort of John Lewis, and in the evening the ground floor becomes a sort of series of sort of pop-up restaurants, with sort of stalls serving different food. I mean, that wouldn't be at all hard, but planning use classes don't currently allow that. So I'm in favour of that sort of innovation and the much greater use in particular sort of meanwhile space, which is a slightly different thing from what we're talking about. But we've done work on meanwhile space in London, and that's another thing which is hugely underutilized. So yes, I think I support that. And as I say, I'm more skeptical about permitted development when it comes to sort of housing. I think it just allows cowboys to do some pretty sort of shoddy things.
Well, the cowboys you refer to will shortly be allowed to build up and add stories to all sorts of development and go up to 30 meters high.
Yeah, indeed. Well, yes, I think as I say, I think we might have to look a bit harder when it comes to sort of housing. I think it's just has a slightly different nature.
There is the Building Better Beautiful Commission, and you have some observations to make in that regard, don't you?
Yeah, which I'm pretty enthusiastic about that, actually. I think the government has sort of two instincts when it comes to planning. One is to go down quite a conventional sort of deregulatory route. I'm not sure that will give us great outcomes. I'm not sure actually in the end the sort of British public will buy it. People care too much about what goes on in their local neighbourhoods. But the other one set out in the Building Better Beautiful Commission is to move from the very reactive character of our planning system in this country to something which is more strategic and where decisions are made upstream. So it is the nature of our planning system that decisions are made on a sort of case-by-case basis, and there's a sort of huge room for negotiation in most cases when it comes to planning permission. And that is not the model in other countries where you get much more use of sort of codes and much more by right development, and the crucial decisions are made upstream in the form of sort of local plans and zoning frameworks. And I'm for that because that's more predictable. It lowers the cost of entering the market. It lowers the risks of development. And I think it allows for a more constructive engagement of the public, upstream in setting plans and setting codes and setting zones. It will be a huge cultural change, and actually you're much closer to these things than me. And I'd be interested to hear from you actually how likely it is that we can really sort of create that. I think what is a sort of big sort of cultural and institutional and sort of legal change in this country. But if we can do it, I'm all for it, and I think we'll get a more constructive, more strategic planning system, and one which potentially has sort of much better outcomes. And it allows planners to think about neighbourhoods or boroughs or even the whole city, as a whole, and think about things like not only the sort of the mix, but also design codes, which I think will be popular with the public. Yeah, so I very much sort of support us going down that route if we can.
Well, that's really fascinating. It's really fascinating for this reason that there is a real prospect that such approaches will come forward in the relatively near future associated with wider planning reform. And it's really fascinating from my own perspective, currently being involved in the South Oxfordshire local plan and seeing engagement with that form of forward planning. That's your point, that communities are interested in seeing and being involved with the way in which zoning,
Yeah.
the future planning, the allocations come forward. And typically one sees well in excess of 100 people, somewhere between 100 and 200 people, watching that examination in public take place via YouTube. You can see how many people are watching it. And it's obvious that there is that interest.
Yeah.
The point which troubles me still is that's South Oxfordshire, which has particular characteristics in terms of education and work patterns. If one takes other parts of the country which are post-industrial, the extent of engagement and the capacity to engage is different. And as somebody who hails from a northern mill town, I'm familiar with that. And what strikes me is that is to a degree recognised by government, who have increased the funding which is available to create neighbourhood plans. And that, I think, is really quite instructive. What's being said there is extra encouragement is needed.
I think that's absolutely right.
In those locations to facilitate the progress of local forward planning. And the story, I think, is different in different localities and needs different measures. And so cities are so different.
That's absolutely right. And there has been a sort of study done by Publica, I think supported by Trust for London, looking at neighbourhood planning in London, and sure enough, where you've got neighbourhood plans, it's largely the more affluent areas. But as you also rightly say, there's certainly be interest in amongst poorer communities in those sorts of decisions. People have very strong views actually about things like, the provision of affordable housing in their local neighbourhoods. But you probably need to sort of engage people in a different way and perhaps throw a bit more resource at it and have a bit more, expert guidance. But people are hugely sort of agitated, engaged in those communities about, particularly the fact that their kids can't afford to stay in them, or there aren't local jobs. I think it's less about them not being interested. It's more about people from those communities needing a bit more sort of guidance and support in navigating the process.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely my impression. And once it's available, the impact can be truly extraordinary. And I've seen that in inquiries where not usually housing development, but other forms of potentially quite intrusive development have been very effectively engaged with by communities in South Wales, in the northeast.
And I also, I do think that people care hugely about design and form, and our planning system, it's very focused on use classes and the uses made of different buildings, and clearly people don't want like polluting factories next to them. But I think people are actually a bit more relaxed about the uses to which buildings are put. And I suppose I'd favour sort of anything which encouraged greater quality of design and a bit less emphasis on use. I think all the evidence is the most successful parts of cities in particular, have changed. The use of the building to which the buildings are put changes over time. I mean, that's partly what makes them resilient. And I actually wonder whether we could move from a system which relies very heavily on use class to determine the use of a building to one which relies a bit more on tax, so that you could have sort of quite generic use classes. And then if you felt as the planning authority or the local government that it was too much resi and not enough workspace, you would actually increase council tax on new resi development and lower it on new business development, as opposed to sort of changing use classes. That's something which has never been tried. I don't even know if they do it in other countries. I suspect they probably do, because they're so more flexible about these things. But I think that's an interesting thing to explore.
So what you've pointed to twice now is the interaction between one lever, planning regulation, and another lever, finance, and the ability to either fund things publicly or to support or suppress particular activities or uses. So your example in respect of the way in which funding is divided up locally or nationally in respect of cities, that's one example where there was you raised that earlier. And this really fascinating idea you've just explained is the interaction between planning levers and potential financial incentives and disincentives. which would promote or disincentivize. And you're saying that that's quite a flexible lever, which is adjustable as you go along.
I think so. I mean, you know, we are a terribly, terribly centralized country by international standards, and our cities, and this is true of London, but it's also true of the other great cities, I know, are very, very underpowered. You know, they have no control over health services. I mean, Manchester's now got a bit, or over many other areas, crime and justice, and you know, risible powers over tax. And I just think giving them a bit more power and letting them, you know, experiment and innovate would be a good thing.
Well, that's a very timely observation. Let's float that via the podcast and see if anybody's listening.
Very good.
Well, Ben, those points have been a real exploration of where we are now, very frankly dealt with, and where we might go to, a vision of places that we might go to, which, for my part, I've hugely enjoyed.
Well, I've enjoyed it too, Richard. It's been great.
Thank you ever so much. Stay safe.
And you. Speak soon.
That was the Planning Podcast. I told you there was a lot in it. If you liked it, then please do share it. If you would like us to pick up and to develop some of those themes, then please just get in touch. Shortly, we'll be turning to planning appeals and another packed interview which I thoroughly enjoyed, this time with Bridget Rosewell, OBE, and her dog. That is part 1. And it will be followed by part 2, a really useful inside track on inquiry practice from JCB, James Corbett Bircher, Planning and Environmental Barrister at No. 5 Chambers. Don't miss either of those, nor indeed the launch of a new book on planning appeals. Until then, stay safe. Thank you for being with us. Until the next time.